Long ago from chaos and darkness was born a planet that would be called Earth 15 billion years later. But first, life would appear on it, simple at first, then more complex. But much later, in the scale of the universe, it was literally yesterday, humans would emerge. In the early 2000s, American accountant Thomas Robertson had his 15 minutes of fame. A company analyzed his DNA and concluded that he was a direct descendant of Genghis Khan. That very one. Of course, newspaper articles immediately appeared, and the lucky ones were already planning to make a movie. But at that time, another company double-checked this data, and the information, alas, was not confirmed. Of course, turning out to be a descendant of a person who once conquered half the world, and generally having distinguished relatives, is an honorable and useful thing. And this is exactly what genealogy has been doing for many centuries, which we will talk about today. Genealogy is probably one of the most ancient sciences or areas of knowledge, because if you open, for example, the New Testament opens with the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Of course, this came from the tribal system. That is, genealogy became most firmly established where society seemed most archaic. Indeed, all known ancient civilizations, Sumerians, Egypt, China, and others, whose remains we can observe today in the world's best museums, were built in the same straightforward way. Father passed to son money, power, status, privileges, and everything else. But supreme power had divine origins and therefore was unchangeable. However, some customs from those times survived until recent past. An example of this is the morganatic marriage between British King Edward VIII and divorced American Wallis Simpson in 1937. Parliament did not recognize this marriage, and Edward was forced to abdicate the throne. Before the abolition of Mesnichestvo, knowing one's genealogy for the highest aristocracy was simply necessary. It was a matter of survival. If you forget who your relatives are, you'll be moved down to a lower step on this ladder. However, starting with Peter I, the estate principle began to weaken, the table of ranks appeared, and a person of common birth could already become a nobleman. In the 19th century, genealogy had already completely moved, I would say, into the scientific realm. The same nobles became interested in this, because many of them had already begun to forget their own genealogy. As Zarathustra, who lived in Persia in the 6th century BC, said, "A person is simply obligated to know their relatives to the 7th generation, which determines many aspects of their life, character traits, and even the future." I welcome it when people want to know their ancestors. There's one well-known surname, which I won't mention now, who approached me to research 4 of his ancestors. And you know, it's so revealing, so amazing, that hundreds of people lived in this world, and then he alone appeared. Grandmother would spread out old photo albums on a large green round table with fringe, and I would escape into that world. That world was absolutely magical to me. There were women in hats, on horses, men with mustaches, with sabers. It was extremely interesting, incomprehensible, and very captivating to me. I never thought that my family's history was somehow different from other families. On one hand. On the other hand, over time, everything changed. Both the attitude toward history and the permissibility of studying it and the openness of archives. I don't think I came to this myself. I think it was the ancestors from above who launched some kind of program, and my life completely changed when I began to deeply study my family's history. And it turned out to be colossal. The question of blood purity, especially in Western Europe, had sacred significance since ancient times. Even to confirm the right to participate in medieval tournaments, it was required that all 16, or even 32 ancestors, both on the male and female lines, belonged to the noble estate. And of course, this was the main issue when dividing inheritance. In Russia, both titles and estates were divided among all sons. All children of Prince Gorchakov were Prince Gorchakov. In the West, it's different. There the main title goes only to the eldest lineage. In Russia, under Peter I, there was an attempt to establish primogeniture so that estates wouldn't be fragmented. This law didn't take root in our country. Everything must be divided equally among us. Well, after 1917, engaging in genealogy became simply dangerous. In Soviet school, the concept of family was not valued at all. Statists said that a person is just trash, and the state is what matters most.
You only know one relative, my father.
But do we really need to know this? But why? Well, to understand history, how they lived, how we should live. Two lineages intersected in my fate and in the fate of all my relatives. The first lineage, Vladimir Lvovich Klumov, actual state councillor, lawyer, university graduate who, despite his orphanage origins, somehow built an excellent career and started a wonderful family. His wife Dorothea Vasilyevna Berman, a native of Tsarskoye Selo, from a literary merchant family, who converted to Orthodoxy and was a music teacher.
She bore Vladimir Lvovich 7 children.
And the second lineage, the Lievenstein family. Here they are, also Muscovites.
Here sits the head of our family, Julius Alexandrovich Lievenstein.
He also had 7 children. His wife was Evdokia Petrovna Musilevskaya, the adopted daughter of Anna Alexandrovna Goncharova, the writer Goncharov's own sister.
Here she is, Anna Alexandrovna Goncharova.
On Pioneer Street in the archive in Tula, I found NKVD card files on all the nobles of Tula province. And there I found references to cases involving my great-grandfather, his relatives, and his family. There lay a piece of paper with the penciled illiterate handwriting of a local policeman who wrote uproot them completely. It was then that the so-called disenfranchised appeared in the country. These were officers, scientists, priests who were deprived, note, under the constitution of that time, of practically all civil rights, and their children weren't even allowed to study. Here's my grandmother, as the eldest of all the children, the only one who finished gymnasium. All her brothers and sisters were expelled from the local Belovskaya gymnasium, explaining that schools are for Soviet children, do as you wish. And so all my grandmother's brothers and sisters, that is, my relatives, they all ended their education in 3rd, 4th, or 5th grade. And that's how they lived their lives, lived them well, lived them as best they could. The population of Tula region at that time was about 1.5 million people. And every third person was disenfranchised. What was a revelation for me was the influence of political life, political times on family history. For example, there's a very famous story that everyone knows.
It's Nadezhda Filartovna von Mekes patronage of Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky.
This is known in all countries of the world. Nevertheless, when Nadezhda Filaretovna von Meck's son was shot in 1929, it turns out there was a verbal instruction at the Tchaikovsky Museum in Klin. If anyone asks whether there are descendants of Nadezhda Filaretovna, you must answer no, because they were either shot or imprisoned. Such discoveries were made. And then came 1990, a surge of interest, thanks to the screws being loosened. This is how the noble assembly emerged. This is how the Historical Genealogical Society in Moscow and the Russian Genealogical Society in St. Petersburg came about. My uncle was given a genealogical tree going all the way back to his very first, probably great-great-great-grandfather. This was probably 20 years ago. It was research from the archives, so we know everyone. People around us have noticeably, in recent years, found it more important, more interesting to learn more about themselves, their origins, and their ancestors. I think we're dealing with a growing demand for self-identification, if you will. Of course, at first the fascination with genealogy had a somewhat snobbish character. People came to me saying, my grandfather, dying, turning to the wall, said that he was probably a prince. Another funny case was that, we have coats of arms in our photograph, so we're probably princes too. I said, well, those are the photographer's coats of arms, not those of the person pictured. Nevertheless, in recent decades, genealogy has gained some development here, both documentary and genetic. Genetics allows us to deal with quite complex cases in our family trees, where classical genealogy, meaning mainly documentary, isn't always able to help us. A simple autosomal test dramatically increases the chances of finding relatives. Nevertheless, we certainly lag behind developed countries here. For instance, Oxford has created a genealogical tree that encompasses 231 million lineages. Every state in the United States has its own genealogical societies. The Mormon Center is probably the largest repository of genealogical information in the world. Well, European researchers today easily trace their ancestors back to the 9th to 10th centuries. Finland had the highest percentage of people researching their genealogy. That is, for such a relatively small country population-wise, there's an incredible number of genealogical societies and people involved in them. A few years ago, through the World Family Tree Portal, I was found by my relative, who is also a documentary filmmaker, living in Finland. He's been working on his genealogy for 20 years and has found over 100,000 blood relatives, almost 3,000 ancestors, among whom are Kiev princes from the 10th century, and some absolutely fantastic literary characters like medieval kings of Denmark, Sicily, Spanish grandees, German barons, and others. A perfect example that all people are essentially brothers and descended from just 18 men and 10 women. So you found relatives who lived in the 10th century, but finding your direct ancestors, especially through the direct male line, turns out to be practically impossible in Russia. At best, it's the beginning of the 17th or end of the 16th century, if we're talking about non-privileged classes, and often even privileged ones. Another famous daughter is Sofia Vladimirovna Kalamova, who was called Cat as a child. She graduated from Nessun School, then studied at Leipzig Conservatory, and later taught at Nessun School. Her first husband was a military man, and her second husband was Pyotr Borisovich Ganishkin, the famous psychiatrist.
And another interesting discovery is the story of this Nikolai Karlovich von Meck at Rüli Gretman.
The greatest man in Russian history, completely unknown. So, after 17 searches and arrests, he was shot. 2 weeks before his execution, his daughter came to see him, who later wrote a very interesting book, as I remember them, quite a voluminous one. And what did she hear from her father? 2 weeks before his execution, he said, "Daughter, just don't hate your country for all this." After traveling to cities, archives, in Tula, Kaluga, and other cities, I know 35 generations of my ancestors. Although my daughter, in the heat of argument, declared that these are my ancestors, not hers, which really amused me. I only know stories about my great-grandfather, but I don't know about my great-great-grandfather. But is there a desire to find out, or not really? Not really, honestly. I was told that Dad wasn't particularly close with them, so we didn't pursue it. Does Mom count? I remember grandmother, but I don't remember about great-grandmother. And here the question arises, is this really necessary? If professional genealogy compilation today costs hundreds of thousands, if not millions of rubles? Titles have been abolished here, and such details aren't really needed for inheritance law either. A genetic passport is very useful information that people should have if they want to know a lot about themselves.
Генетический паспорт – это очень полезная информация, которую желательно, если люди хотят о себе многое знать, то можно иметь.
But it should be used very carefully. There are monogenic diseases caused by genetic changes, mutations in specific genes. But there are diseases with hereditary predisposition. That is, polygenic diseases, for example, hypertension, which is caused by a combination of dozens and hundreds of genes. For the development of such diseases, environment and our lifestyle play a bigger role than genes. These are predispositions that may or may not develop. And there are also questions about the ownership of our genome. Today in many countries, commercial testing is only possible with a doctor's referral or court decision. First, because of numerous errors in interpreting genetic information, plus privacy concerns.
What will it tell you?
It can actually tell you about your origin through haplotypes. Enormous genomic studies have now been conducted that can show each person's origin. The presence of various nationalities in you. During testing, it's unknown who passed what to me, whose genes were stronger and suppressed other genes. Therefore, a large amount of information can be lost because every person has dominant genes. This strong gene suppressed everything else. Genetics won't give you names. Genetic methods can and should be used in genealogy, but with great caution and a thorough understanding of what genetics can and cannot provide. First of all, you need to focus on what kind of organization it is. There are organizations, especially private ones, that might just tell you for advertising purposes that you're descended from Ivan the Terrible or someone else. But people want what they want. We all love living in the illusions we create for ourselves. The commercialization of this issue has become very strong. There are a huge number of agencies that have emerged on this topic, developing it like gold or even uranium ore. Unfortunately, current residents of our country want it to be beautiful, to be no less than a prince, and preferably an emperor. Don't think that we're against genetics, which unfortunately has happened in our history. We simply want to say that science, unfortunately, doesn't provide clear-cut answers. Our future fate depends on what society we grew up in, what community we grew up in, what family we grew up in, what we read.
And everything else.
We can't change our eye color, but we can change our intelligence level, raise it or lower it. If a person starts to realize what they're doing and takes control of themselves and begins to critically evaluate their actions, they can change themselves. And here another natural question arises. If our origin and hereditary traits don't influence our fate so strongly, is it even worth spending time and money studying our genealogy? But this is a question that obviously everyone must answer for themselves. When a person doesn't know their roots, when society consists of people who don't remember their kinship, this society is absolutely irresponsible. It doesn't answer to the memory of its ancestors. Really, I am whoever I want to be, and that to the doctor, it makes no sense to me. If there's no history, then there's actually no future either, because your children will treat you exactly the same way. Besides, this gives a certain more stoic and philosophical view of life.
In my opinion,
We have one of the Davidoff relatives, a very enthusiastic genealogist, who has 2,500 of these little squares filled in. But I'm more interested in what people did. That is, belonging to great or completely great names is no guarantee that you're also great. I know many such examples. It seems to me, it's more important to know the facts about your ancestors, what you can be proud of them for in the past, and how this affects your life today. And you need to raise your children so that you won't be ashamed before your ancestors. Genealogy doesn't make people more noble. Only work makes a person more noble, smarter, and more honest. Genealogy made me as a person, as a boy from a communal apartment, from a criminal courtyard where I had to fight every day just to be able to walk home. It made me into who I became. And I'm grateful to my fate for that.